this event, it's another activity of this project that many think tanks from Western Balkans and from the European Union are implementing this project. The topic of the panel that we are academic panel that we are having now, it's community and youth engagement and resilience to extremism. This is really important topic because usually from the research that we have conducted in last 10 years, usually the violent extremist organizations have a target the youth, and the youth were the main vulnerable communities from the violent extremist organization and for their recruitment purposes. And also the best way how we can counter these ideologies, this phenomenon, is if we build the community resilience and the youth resilience against violent extremism. To discuss much more about this topic, we have two very distinguished guests. We have two professors. One is Mima Ramiz from the University of Barcelona, and the second professor, which has done a lot of research on this topic, is Bennett Ganesh from the University of Groningen. Both professors will give you really good insights on this topic, and for each of them will have 20 minutes to give their speech for you. So it is my pleasure to give the floor to Professor Rami.
Good morning, my name is Mima Ramiz, and my presentation today, I'm coming from the University of Barcelona, from CREA, and my presentation will introduce some theory grounding our work at CREA. Basically, it's the social impact approach and the coercive discourse towards attraction to violence. And also, I will give you some findings from part of the research we are doing on this topic. First, very briefly about CREA itself. CREA is a network of researchers and in different disciplines and from more than 20 universities. And we have a long experience in research on the European projects and regional and national projects in different topics, not only in the social sciences and humanities, but also in other topics. And the one I will be focusing on today is our line on analysis of the dominant coercive discourse towards attraction to violence and the impact this has on the issues we are dealing here today in order to prevent extremism, especially among the youth. So to give you some focus, some background on the theory grounding our work, my main point will be how we develop our research with this focus on the social impact. Understanding social impact as the improvements or benefits that we provide society with as a result of our research. For the last years, we might all be very acquainted with this, of course, that there is a trend in not only in Europe, but worldwide about the importance of analyzing the impact of our research, being able to showcase to citizenship how our research does have a positive impact, and especially the social impact of the research beyond the economic and the scientific. The European Commission has done much research in this regard, and much efforts have been developed. For instance, the Impact TV project that was coordinated by Ramon Flecha from CREA, in FP7, this evaluated the impact and outcomes of SSH research in the social sciences and the humanities. And as a result of the project, there was an expert group created that had to define the indicators and the mechanisms to monitor the social impact. No? There was an evaluation done of age 2020, and now Flecha was also commissioned by the EC to develop the indicators and mechanisms to monitor and assess the impact in the current framework program in Horizon Europe, just recently started. So this has been always the social impact approach. It has somehow permeated all our research, is the focus of our research, and it has also been the contribution from CREA in the Proton project. That is also a Horizon 2020 project searching to model the processes leading to organized crime and terrorist networks, in which CREA participated with an analysis on analysis on the ethical and societal impact of the counterterrorism and prevention organized crime policies. And some of these research findings are the ones I will be sharing here with you today, the ones who are related to the topic that we are discussing. Second theory conceptualization I wanted to share with you is the existence of this coercive discourse towards attraction to violence that I was mentioning in the beginning. We all know we are into this topic, so we all know how literature has highlighted the importance of socializing agents, the importance of pre-existing friendships, how this can, and communities, how this can be agents leading to or preventing from falling prey to networks leading to radicalization or extremism. There is, in this regard, there is another element that is very important to what extent will these socialization agents be the community, family, friendship, which role will they play, which impact will they have, and this is also affected by this coercive discourse towards attraction to violence. Let me say some words how we understand this coercive discourse. It is the discourse, the dominant discourse in society in many different spheres of our lives, not only among friends and peers or communities, but in society, in the media, etc. That is sustained by a power imbalance between in relations and in interactions, and that socializes into having an attraction for violence, for violent behaviors and violent attitudes, persons, individuals, while at the same time non-violent people and non-violent actions and behaviors are seen as convenient, but not as exciting or attractive. This is something we are seeing all the time in different spheres of life, but two ideas or 2 points can be derived from that statement that I was just doing. On the one hand is when we see, and we were talking just before about recent riots in the Netherlands, but we are seeing this happening in many different contexts. The fact is, for many different reasons, but the point is when boasting about having set fire to a rubbish bin makes you more popular, makes you more desirable or attractive, both for social relations, but also for sexual affective relations. And another very important element in this is how we understand the importance of language in this development, language that can de-glamorize violence, that can have a very important role in this. So for this matter, to contest the coercive discourse, we will need, and we will see this back with our findings, we will need 2 elements in one way. So on the one hand, we need the support, brave support of upstanders, people around in the community as friends and equals, peers, that allow you to say no to certain attitudes and say no to things that you are not wanting to do, but sometimes feel forced or influenced into doing. Only one person supporting you, be it boy or girl, can make a whole difference to overcome this coercion that youth start suffering. And then the other point is the importance of creating counter narratives, language narratives, another use of narratives that shifts the attraction from those violent behaviors to non-violent persons and non-violent relations, and making them very explicit in the type of interactions that are occurring within the community, among the youth, and in any of the contexts we are working. The findings I will present are, as I said, are some of the findings from the Proton work, from the work of CREA in the context of the Proton project, which was larger. and have been developed through the communicative methodology of research, which has always been the methodology used by CREA and has been highlighted and by different funders like the European Commission for an added value it brings to be able to achieve the social impact I was telling you about before. I have no time now to go more into detail about the methodology, but I can answer any questions if necessary afterwards. So the two some findings I will present are coming from the desk research we did, analyzing literature and the policies, as I mentioned before, but also from the qualitative fieldwork implemented with stakeholders, end users, policy makers from 6 different countries dealing with these policies. Among the findings, very briefly about the desk research, and then I would like to share you some of the quotes from the fieldwork. The analysis of the policies, what told us is the confirmation that that very little systematic analysis is being done about the impact that these policies that are being implemented are having on the youth, on the communities. And this was a confirmation of an assumption we already had, a pre-assumption that we wanted to analyze. And among the analysis that we did find, we found some positive and negative impacts. I will mention first some of the negative ones, and then I will say the positive ones that I can link then afterwards with the findings from the fieldwork. On the one hand, negative ones, there is many of them, but I highlight these 2 here that you see highlighted in blue color. One is the second order of harassment that families and of different communities, mostly people working in prevention and de-radicalisation, are suffering. This is a fact. This is existing and it's there, and we could identify it. And another of the negative findings is something that we also have been working. The sexual affective relationships based on attraction to violence are present. Most of the great majority of the agents we talk to and the end users are really aware that this is there, the present, this attraction to violence, but it's not being considered as a key element either to understand how the processes are going or, and most importantly, to provide clues about how to overcome this very worrying situation. And as for the positive societal and ethical impacts, again, there are many more, but we have a very lack of time, very little time. So I highlight 2 also to make a link with fieldwork. On the one hand, this importance of promoting democracy in a way, it's easy to say, but in a way of creating spaces, environments where dialogue and critical thinking and civil participation is really promoted among these communities and these youth. And on the other hand, the importance that creating these counter narratives among communities, narratives that do not glamorize violence, but on the contrary, that are very clear and firm in the rejection of violence and in order to prevent this from happening. We have seen this, as I mentioned, with the different stakeholders that we worked with and the end users, former radicalized people, de-radicalized people also. And so I highlight here some of the quotes in order to bring their voices somehow. It is important to, the key actors are those that are non-violent peers, family networks, communities, again, who reject, who are very clear in a message of rejecting violence. And we can think, and I'm sure of many examples where one important individual in a community, it makes a change if he or she has a position for or against violence. Then again, the importance in the community of friendship, like we were saying before, friendships that can be not any friendship. I had some quote that very clearly makes a difference between what girls who were into these networks saw as friends, and after speaking with them and coming back 3 months later, in a process of working intervention with them, they realize what real friends are. And first they say, oh, I got 8 or 10 friends. And when you explain what are we talking about friendship, they say, oh no, I have none. So the importance of friendship, that can be a lifesaver, and creating communities of upstanding agents, the key concept of being able to upstand for someone you care for. This is also important. Well, this is more about what I was telling you, but coming from another community stakeholder here, in this one in the UK. And then another important finding is the fact that, as I was saying before, the coercive discourse of attraction to violence exists. It is there. Everybody can identify it, and we got a lot of examples from it, and like we can see here. And what we recall from the theory we were mentioning before, we need these 2 elements to face this coercive discourse: the freedom to decide, and then we need support for that, and the language. So let's see 2 more, and with this I will be finishing, 2 more findings from the fieldwork. This is an association acting in Birmingham and London boroughs, who are creating these environments that allows to debunk myths. And this is very important, how they are allowing the creation of trustworthy relationships with these youths, where meaningful conversations can happen, where the kids or youths don't get judged or don't feel judged, and banishing the positive attractive myths about the culture, the criminal culture, the culture of gangs, etc. And then we have to finish with this experience of communities. These are communities acting in different contexts in many countries in the world, and there is thousands of those projects already being implemented, and there is they act in different contexts, but also for what we are talking about here, in highly complex contexts. And from the fieldwork, we also gathered these statements that the elements for success that they were identifying is the implementation of certain actions who unveil through critical thinking, like we have seen before, this coercive discourse and attraction to violence. Children who are speaking about it very clearly, openly. On the one hand, like we see here, one of the quotes from a stakeholder working with those communities, speaking about what it is to be a harasser, what it is to build complicities, what an aggressor is, and what second order harassment is, or things like that. Speaking, calling things by their name, as she says here. And this community model is also based on this dialogic model of violence prevention that you see here, which revolves around the creation of a norm in which the whole community agrees and commits to respecting, and how this and the importance of using a language that creates these counter narratives of violent-free behaviors is achieving the goal that they're searching of, having a violent-free context. Here we can see another quote about how the use of language in their community is allowing children to shift attraction to what is good and non-violent as a protective factor, preventing violence and extremism in this context.
I will ask the Professor Bennett to start with his presentation, and then we'll open the space for the question from the participants.
So I think the last presentation kind of brought us towards something that I'd like to talk about today, which is specifically about counter-narratives. I'd like to kind of take a critical approach to counter-narratives. And what I'd like to do is spend a little time assessing the role of counter-narratives in countering right-wing extremism. So I'm going to take us a little bit away, I think, from the kind of core focus today about youth resilience, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. But what I'd like to start out by saying now is that what we've started to see, especially in the last few years, is that extremism, and specifically far-right extremism, has started to emerge as a governance problem that that social media platforms, governments, and civil society are increasingly involved with. So, of course, in 2014, 2015, we saw kind of governments and social media platforms, specifically Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, really start taking serious and strong action to deplatform IS-associated accounts. Now, this has become much more controversial for some reason when it comes to right-wing extremism, and I'll get into some of those reasons as we go along in this presentation. But one of the main things here is that the proximity of right-wing extremism to actual kind of government power, kind of most obvious, of course, in the Trump administration, but it's not limited to that point, has really raised a whole set of questions and a lot of complexities around trying to deal with extremism. But on the whole, platforms over the last few years, so talking primarily about Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and other kinds of large mainstream platforms like that, have been dealing with multiple aspects of extremism for quite some time, right? That includes hateful content, glorification of violence, and disinformation. And the approach has primarily been to focus on content, right? We take down certain posts, or we take down certain users who continuously post, let's say, hateful content, for example. Over time, we've also seen that there's been more and more multi-stakeholder-led approaches where really states and platforms have been working together quite a bit to try to deal with extremism. This started, like I said, 2014, 2015, primarily with IS content, and now it's moving into dealing with the far right more seriously now. And if we want to think about what policy instruments have been designed to address this problem, I'd say there's broadly two policy instruments that have been used. The first is content moderation, which I'll explain soon enough, and the second is strategic communication. Content moderation refers specifically to taking down users in content. Platforms make the decision about what kind of content gets moderated. And strategic communication generally refers to the use of different kinds of counter messaging and propaganda techniques. So those are the two ways primarily that we've dealt with extremism once platforms, civil society, and governments have framed this as a problem for policy to address. So I know this is a bit of a busy slide, but I just want to walk you through the differences between content moderation and strategic communication. So as I've said, content moderation is focused on the detection, evaluation, and takedown of content and users that produce this content. Sarah Roberts has a really great book on this topic called Behind the Screen that I really recommend if you want to learn more about this. For some years now, law enforcement can make recommendations for content moderation and taking down certain kinds of content through internet referral units. And now we've also seen, especially with NetzDG in Germany, statutory mechanisms being used to take down content. And ultimately, platforms have the final say and ultimate authority on content moderation. I think that's important to remember. Governments can pressure them. Governments can pass laws to force companies to do something, but ultimately the companies are the ones that make the decisions. In terms of how we evaluate and understand content moderation, we're trying to understand, what kind of effect does it have in terms of disrupting and countering extremism. So what we see is primarily the measurement of migration and travel to other platforms after certain accounts get deplatformed, right? So we've heard about, for example, the kind of shift from Twitter to Parler, and then once Parler got shut down, then we had lots of people going to Telegram, right? That's been some recent moves within right-wing extremist circles. So that's one of the ways we can evaluate it. Second way is really trying to understand what are the benefits that they get after these kind of deplatforming events happen. And what we've seen is that content moderation and takedown tend to result in significantly reduced benefits for extremists and a lot less visibility. So that's content moderation. And then on the other side is strategic communication. And to understand strategic communication, we should understand that strategic communication, of course, is a field that kind of goes back quite a long time. But it really is, focus on creating different kinds of persuasive kinds of content that fit behind a particular kind of political purpose. That purpose in this instance would be to counter extremism. That still is definitively propaganda, but that doesn't mean that propaganda is inherently bad or inherently undemocratic, but that propaganda can be used as a way of trying to counter extremist messaging. However, what we're starting to see is that some of the use of strategic communication, especially in the counterterrorism world, has been kind of built on shaky scientific foundations. So again, when we're talking about strategic communication in the counter-extremism space, we're really thinking about counter-messaging and counter-propaganda. What's interesting, though, here is that we're starting to see a lot of different providers of strategic communication services. That's including the public and private sector. So we're talking about advertising conglomerates, all kinds of countering extremism, let's say smaller enterprises that are working in this area. And then we're also seeing a lot of state-funded initiatives in this area. Now, how then do we go about evaluating strategic communication? So first, strategic communication tends to focus primarily on social media metrics, right? So it's looking at likes and impressions, but it's a lot thinner in terms of understanding and representing human behavior. There is quite a bit of qualitative evaluation based on individual cases in the literature surrounding kind of evaluations in strategic communication. If you look at RAN, the Radicalisation Awareness Network, that's an EU initiative, we've seen a lot of kind of push for doing both social media metrics and qualitative evaluation, which is very important. And then one of the key points, and I'm going to come to this later, is that a lot of these evaluations are kind of undertaken by actors that also have a business interest in using counter-narratives. I'm going to come back to that in a few moments. But I think what I'm trying to suggest here is that counter-narratives are part of a political response to violent extremism. But when it comes to dealing with countering extremism, what we're starting to see is that counter-narratives there's a lot of confidence and promise being put into counter-narratives. I'm not really sure that counter-narratives, though, that there's enough evidence to support the idea that counter-narratives can be a reliable tool in building the kind of resilience that we would need to counter extremism in the first place. But to make that point, I think we need to sort of situate counter-narratives in the broader sorts of domains of countering violent extremism that we've seen. Now, this is one breakdown of countering violent extremist activity that's quite common in the literature. What we have is sort of three levels: the primary, secondary, and tertiary levels of CVE. So counter-narratives, of course, play a role in all of them. And what we've seen is that the idea in primary CVE is that counter-narratives can reduce the likelihood of radicalization across a population. So here we're talking about maybe the mainstreaming of extremist narratives, but we also have to ask the question if what can counter-narratives even do when extremist narratives are being produced by politicians? Second, we might want to think about how might counter-narratives help us in addressing the spread of racist and misogynist disinformation. And then I think most interestingly, most exciting in this area is encouraging positive alternatives such as anti-hate campaigns. And I'll come a little bit to talking about that in a few moments. In the secondary space, what we see is that there is a focus on, in secondary CVE, focusing on those who are actually vulnerable to radicalization. So here we're thinking about targeted messages to communities that are swayed by extremist narratives. But unfortunately, there's not a lot of evidence to support the idea that counter-narratives actually sway those that are enamored by extremist narratives. This is similar to work that's been done on disinformation, that fact checks at certain points and at certain times can have a really serious impact. But overall, it's very unlikely that fact checking, for example, will challenge the kind of communities that push out disinformation or push out extremist narratives. So there's limits here, especially when we're talking about those who are vulnerable to radicalization, limits in terms of what counter-narratives can do. And then finally, at the tertiary level, CVE tends to focus on those that are already radicalized. So here, of course, counter-narratives, I think, are also really crucial. But what we see is that counter-narratives tend to be used with exit work, tailored interpersonal meetings with individuals to address radicalization and offer exits, right? So in this kind of category, counter-narratives are an important part, but it's already kind of built into the mentorship and social work that characterizes tertiary CVE. So counternarratives play a role in all of these different CVE domains. But I think it's important to try to understand how counternarratives fit into a broader kind of puzzle about how platforms are governing the far right. So I wanted to kind of ask a broader question. When we're talking about counternarratives, what are the rationalities and logics that shape our governance that shape platform governance, of right-wing extremism? And here, when I'm raising these questions about platform governance, I'm particularly kind of interested in the ideas about the platform society that José van Dijk and her colleagues have been developing. And one of the interesting points that's made in a paper in that broader project is this idea that the rationalities and logics of platforms intersect with other rationalities and logics. That's what I'm trying to show with this diagram here. So Van Dijk and Pohl refer to what they call social media logic, which is driven by programmability, popularity, connectivity, and datafication. I think here one of the things that's important to remember is popularity and connectivity. In particular, right-wing extremist content is particularly effective in developing popularity and virality on platforms and connecting a wide range of users. Now, this feeds into the kinds of logics that CVE actors use when they're trying to address extremism on social media. So what we're seeing is that there's a lot of multi-stakeholder initiatives, but usually, especially with platforms in the state, it's limited to organizations that are vetted and approved by usually government agencies. So we see this especially with the Home Office in the United Kingdom, making decisions about what organizations are credible enough to do this kind of work. We see, of course, that there's a lot of use in CVE of non-coercive and voluntary approaches that are focused on counter-propaganda, especially when groups are not overtly sanctioned, right? And when we're talking about right-wing extremists, most of them do not fall on a list that bans their activity. This has been a very recent development with a few groups, for example, in the UK. As we've seen previously, CVE logic has really tended to focus overwhelmingly on the Muslim community and has really only very recently shifted to thinking about right-wing extremism. Now that mix of CVE logic and social media logic kind of then mixes into what I also refer to as free speech logic, which is this kind of extension of First Amendment jurisprudence and ideologies from the Silicon Valley to the rest of the world, right? And obviously there are fundamentally different theories and ideas in legal jurisprudence in Europe about freedom of speech as opposed to the United States. But the broader point is that the marketplace of ideas will solve the problem. And this works really in social media companies' interest because it says, okay, instead of taking down our users that are popular and help connect those on our platform, instead of taking down those users, let's just try to send them counter narratives online so that we put more speech and that will challenge those ideas, and the marketplace of ideas will eventually solve the problem. Now, that is obviously an idea that really fits into platforms' interests and their agenda, right? Because instead of taking down posts that are popular, instead of taking down specific kinds of actors that might be engaged in extremist narratives, but connecting large numbers of people together, what we have here is that this is kind of confidence. Instead of taking that stuff down, we just put more and more narratives out there, more posts out there. And that's something that overwhelmingly at the end of the day really starts to benefit social media platforms because it's more content for them rather than actually dealing with the broader dynamics that lead to toxicity, hate, and violent extremism on their platforms. So I want to go through perhaps one of the more paradigmatic examples of kind of formal counter-narrative work, and that's referring to Moonshot CVE, which is a private company based in the United Kingdom. It was previously incubated by Google's Jigsaw, and it now receives various government contracts. So what they did was they developed what's called the redirect method, which is using Google's own advertising technology to recommend videos on YouTube. So for extremist content, the redirect method points people watching extremist videos, let's say, to content that offers an anti-extremist narrative. So this sounds like an exciting and quite innovative approach. But it also reveals how these logics that I've just described kind of work together. So while this is really interesting, it also happens alongside recommendation systems that kind of enhance the discoverability of extremist content. So you might have the redirect method giving users ads to challenge extremist content, but you also have, let's say, Facebook's algorithmic recommendations or YouTube's algorithmic recommendations, then also reinforcing the pathways by which people actually access and stumble on extremist content. So there is also some evidence here that I think should raise some skepticism about these kinds of models. Similar initiatives have been shown to actually increase exposure to extremism precisely because of these algorithmic linkages created by the platform. So what we have here is kind of a project that sounds really interesting, but at the end of the day, really just creates a bigger market for Google's advertising products and encourages stakeholders to pay to use Google software to counteract the effects of its own failures, right? So its algorithmic recommendation of YouTube videos has been shown over and over to be recommending extremist content. And what we have is Google incubates a private company that says, pay Google advertising money in order to recommend people different stuff, right? And so here, what we're talking about are the ways in which the interests of the platforms and the logics of popularity and profitability are kind of coming together in the way that these kinds of formal approaches to counter narratives are being developed. There's also some pretty serious limitations when it comes to redirection. So if we look at this, there's looking at a set of searches on Facebook for extremist content, there were about 57,000 searches. Of those, 2,288 actually looked at the kind of redirect content that Facebook was giving to its users, which was actually just directing them to de-radicalisation groups that are kind of in the tertiary and secondary CVE space. Of those people who clicked on that information, only 25 remained to actually get help. So we're talking about 25 out of 57,000. Now, I don't want to diminish the importance of helping 25 people. That is really important, and that's an achievement on its own. However, there's a lot of confidence placed in these kinds of initiatives. I think this infographic that comes just from Moonshot's own report on this shows that this is really going to help us only with a really tiny sliver of the broader problem. So I don't think right now that the picture, especially when it comes to these kind of formal counter-narrative activities that come from and are developed and incubated within the platform, within platform governance systems, are very promising. Other studies of counter-narratives have also kind of shown similar minimal uptake. And also data from other companies, such as the tech, not companies, other NGOs, like the Tech Transparency Project, found that, for example, when Facebook was trying to redirect people, it was only when they made verbatim searches for the words white supremacy or white nationalism. But if they said something that was related to that in a search, that was not going to deliver kind of the kind of redirects that Facebook claimed that it would. And overall, the platform is still delivering recommendations for extremist groups. So I want to finish here with some perhaps kind of more speculative remarks about youth engagement and informal counter-narratives. I think one of the key arguments that come up very, very often is the idea that, that youth need to improve their skills in terms of digital literacy. But one of the things that we see, especially when it comes to right-wing extremists, is that the young people that are involved with these communities are actually extremely digitally literate. They're really good at using the internet. They understand, for example, how to even hijack the infrastructure of platforms for their own interests. So what we need to do is really have a conversation about the political parameters about how these kinds of counter-narratives are being developed, or these initiatives that are focusing on digital literacy. Of course, these are things that we have to keep doing, but that's not going to be what gives us, I think, the leverage that we need or the power that we need to counter right-wing extremism. So formal counter-narratives, as I've said, kind of delivered through platforms, I think we should be really skeptical because they fail to address underlying problems, which is the platform's infrastructure itself, right? So they're creating and incubating an economy or a set of complementary industries to address a market that they've created from their own failures, right? So this is a pretty serious kind of issue in terms of how counter-narratives are being formed. But I do think that there is some hope, and I think this is really where youth engagement can make a huge difference. So what we started to see in some recent research, particularly by Benjamin Lee and Kate Coyer, they found that informal counter-narratives are actually much more promising. These are kind of just everyday creativity of users that are working to maintain social prohibitions on extreme ideas and behaviors. They use parody, satire, and humor, and this can bring diverse coalitions together that are united against extremist narratives. But I think it's important that we think about the limits here. Informal ensembles of users have to overcome the platform power and structure that I've been trying to talk about here. Further, more speech doesn't necessarily convince those that are enamored by extremist narratives. So ultimately, I don't think more speech is the answer. Even informal counter-narratives, which focus more on speech to challenge extremists, they still play into the interests of platforms. However, it's important to bring these informal ensembles of users together because they can reinforce these social prohibitions on extreme ideas. So I sort of want to end with this broader question is how and what are and how can young people overcome the structural barriers that affect how they as informal actors might engage in counter-narratives and be heard. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope this was an informative presentation. I look forward to the Q&A to come.
Thank you, Professor Ganesh, for your great presentation. And it's time for the questions from the participants. So please, if anyone has a questions, you're more than welcome.
I have a simple question to Mimar Ramiz. So you talk about the social impact. So for your research, what kind of indicators that you use to understand, to evaluate, to measure the social impact, especially about the vulnerable youth, in order to prevent them from engaging in violence? What kind of, maybe data simply to measure this social impact, because it's very controversial in some cases, and we can't really, there's a lack of about on this topic, I think. So
thank you, Erkan, for your question. Indeed, it's a controversial issue, and there is increasingly more data and recommendations about it, but it is still unknown to some extent. As I was mentioning, I would give you I would like to share two questions. On the one hand, it really depends on which context and research we are talking about. No? I'll go back now to the concrete example we are talking about here, but it is important that the European Commission has defined this document about the monitoring the social impact, where there are defined the pathways that research can consider in order to identify how to measure this. And this can be helpful if you would like to have more information about it, because it gives you a hint on any sort of research, how can you monitor the impact that your research is having throughout the development of the project and also afterwards. As regards the case we are talking about now, we have also two different sorts of data. On the one hand, we need to collect quantitative data, which can showcase the impact it has on a certain community. For instance, and this needs to be measurable, as you say. No, this needs to be number of fights that are compared to the previous period, or number of actions of upstanding against violent act, or things like that. And it is important in this, the community, the methodology, the communicative methodology plays a very important role. because as it is meant to create social impact from the very beginning, the communicative methodology is used already from the definition of the research project. If we are defining a project in a wide community with associations, etc., with those communities, we can know the priorities. Then during the project, the communicative methodology veils for that the voices of the end users come together with those of the researchers and policymakers in order to create a pathway that can give and help those indicators that I was telling you about as an example. This is one thing. And the other thing is that we also, through the methodology, we have to collect, in this case, qualitative indicators that can give us, again, confirmation or not of whether these indicators that we had predefined in the process of preparing the proposal of the project, for instance, are being achieved or not. And in ex post, this would be in itinere, but if we go to the social impact ex post, is going to those communities, like the communities I was presenting you here, who are already implementing the project for a couple of years, be it 5, 10, whatever, and they can tell us how this use of the successful actions that they have been implementing are having an in-depth change into their community, not only superficial in like how many fights or whatever, but really a change in the way of the social cohesion created through this community that, of course, as you all can imagine, has an impact in many other areas of these communities, not only in the social cohesion, but then we have examples how this directly impacts economic areas, learning, prospects for the future, etc. I hope I answer. I know it's a complex issue, but I'm really delighted that you raised the point.
My question is like, there is a trend of the growing of the left and right wing extremists everywhere in the world, but in particular in the Western Europe. So how can this right and left wing extremism or ethno-nationalist extremism can have an impact in the increasing the religious-based extremism, in this case, Islamic extremism, for example, in the Western Europe?
It is a very complex question, of course, and I cannot give you the answer because I don't have, I have not done research on this particular topic that you are raising, but indeed it is a very concern. It is a high concern for many of us. And in my point of view, but from what we know, I will go back to what I was introducing about the fact that extremisms are growing, whether left wing or right wing or religious or any other kind, lays in the, as research is showing us, lays in this dominant discourse, this dominant coercive discourse. From the moment we are able to contest this dominant coercive discourse that links attraction to violence, it will be much more possible to create a change deep in the communities, be them religious or non-religious, to contest any kind of extremism. So I think it is, let's say, unfortunately, that the presence of this coercive discourse is universal, to say it's everywhere. It's not only in right or left wing, but in any sort of extremism, because it lays on a discourse that permeates all our relations. I was talking here about the way it affects children and youth, but I think we are all aware of millions of examples in the media, in the movies, in songs, in the literature. So as long as this critical thinking is being done and deep change in the communities is done through acknowledging the existence and the power we have to contest this, there will be less force or less power for extremism of any kind. I know I don't exactly answer your question, but it's the point I can give you from the research I know. Thank you.
Yeah, I think there's quite a few points in that answer that I think are really important. And I want to pick up just on the point around discourse here, right? And coercive discourse. So I suppose I probably have to read your definition of coercive discourse to fully understand whether we're talking about the same thing. But when it comes to outrage, when it comes to effectively charged kind of communications, when it comes to the kind of animosity that we get from particular extremist groups towards the outgroups that they target, we know that social media algorithms for some time have been promoting the travel and amplification of these kinds of narratives. So when we're talking also, like if we're thinking about coercive discourse, right? Thinking about also what are the infrastructures and systems that are in play in our media system that actually accelerate those processes is really, really important. I mean, I'm cautious to sort of think about, are political, or let's say ethno-nationalist forms of extremism, particularly the vast majority of that is on the right, is that leading to an increase in Islamist extremism, right? And there's a lot of theories about kind of reciprocal radicalization. And I think we should bear some skepticism towards that, in the sense of what we have is, you know, I don't think there's necessarily a relationship between kind of like Islamist extremism being amplified by what's going on from other kinds of extremist groups. But we do see that, for example, the mainstreaming of Islamophobia, which is very much the case in so many European countries now, is something that provides ammunition for recruitment, for example, for jihadists, right? So I mean, that's different than right-wing extremism causing the problem, right? It's a bit less direct. But I think also when it comes to right-wing extremists, we see that they have a really strong desire to go out and engage with, especially using social media, with groups that they don't like and people that they don't like, in particular leftists and feminists online, right? And so when we're talking about network harassment that's kind of articulated by these groups, it's primarily left-wing women who tend to bear the brunt of that kind of harassment, right? So I think when we're looking at this broader problem, and looking at these interactions between different kinds of extremism, I think it's good to keep in mind the animosity. And then also going back to this point, I think about discourse in general, right? What are the ways in which discourse gets amplified, and how does it travel? How is it disseminated when it's being mediated through these kinds of digital communication systems? I think those are two things that can help us get a better answer to that question.
But you talked about deplatforming. So you are very skeptical about especially the formal counter-narrative programs delivered through these platforms. Why, as you mentioned earlier, that these platforms led to the acceleration, not help to stop them. But at the same time, the logic of these social media platforms is giving more freedom, more space to everyone. So deplatforming and giving too much space, these are some contradictory measures or approaches. But however, what you talked about at the same time, you talked about the informal counter narrative. So like for example, this brings us the everyday creativity, everyday life. But if you look at the youth, they spend too much time on the screen, on different social media platforms, on games, for example. Even if we are absent in these platforms, if we not produce some alternative or counter narratives, then we give all of this space specifically to these extremist groups, because these extremist groups also they are using this everyday creativity, like you said, the parody, the humor. So they bring their coalitions there as well. So within this antagonism, so within this liberty, the youth may choose also this extremist content as well. So I'm a little bit confused with this deplatforming, giving the whole freedom to everyone, Can you just give more? Even you give an example, a good example of the algorithm of the Facebook, said that only a few, very tiny few people that choose these alternative messages by using these algorithms. But at the same time, I don't know what can be the solution.
It's a good question, because this is an extremely difficult problem to solve. I appreciate your point about maybe a contradiction here between the idea of deplatforming on the one hand, and then also my optimism around informal counter-narratives. So I think the core of this discussion needs to revolve, especially when it comes to narratives on social media, it needs to revolve around not counter-narratives that debunk extremist ideas. I don't think we're going to be successful trying to debunk extremist ideas for a whole host of reasons. What I think has a lot more promise is that we have informal ensembles of users that already exist on these platforms that maintain a social prohibition against these kinds of ideas, right? And so that has to be something that happens at a repeated and let's say kind of quotidian level. Now, and that's a process that is going on. But the problem is that the platform infrastructures themselves don't necessarily benefit those that are producing the informal counter-narratives. They benefit those that are actually producing the extremist narratives. And yes, of course, both are using parody, satire, humor, etc. quite effectively. But one side is using that in order to maintain that prohibition on extremist ideas. But where this breaks down, and where ultimately I think this is a structural and political problem, not one that can be solved with discourse or narratives, but it's a question of power, is that ultimately, when it comes to maintaining a social prohibition on extremist content or extremist ideas, which has been throughout history really necessary in order to defeat this, defeat extremism in its various permutations, is platforms need to step up and say, no, you can't say this, right? Now, what we've seen is that platforms over and over again have been over-policing certain communities and then under-policing others, right? And the communities that get under-policed, that face less deplatforming, are the ones that produce anti-Muslim hatred, that produce anti-Black narratives, that are anti-Semitic, right? And those things are only starting to change now. And that's really about their proximity to political power. And also to the fact that, especially in Western Europe, we have a lot of these new radical right parties that are using exactly those kinds of narratives to win votes. So I think when we're talking about this, right, it's got to be about informal ensembles of users speaking out, but that's always going to be based on the structural possibilities that the platform actually gives them. So ultimately, maybe I see this too much in a top-down way, but based on all of the things that I've looked at, we're not going to solve this problem until we get muscular with the platforms to actually change the structures here.
Thank you, Professor Kenneth, for your answer. We are almost done with the timeline that we have for these discussions. If anyone has the last questions, or if not, we thanks a lot both professors for their great speeches and the great insights that they gave to us about this very important topic and very important topic. So I hope that we will see each other again in the next activities of the project. Thanks to everyone, and best wishes for you and all.